It was 9:17 on a Saturday morning when everything snapped. The Texas sun was already baking the ground, sweat rolling down my back as I fought a stubborn fence post into the dirt. The rhythmic clang of my post hole digger echoed through the neighborhood, sharp and metallic. Then came the sound no homeowner wants to hear in their own yard: police sirens. 3 squad cars tore into my driveway, gravel spitting out from under their tires. I froze, mud-caked gloves still gripping the handle, as 3 officers stepped out with that cautious stance every cop learns early, feet apart, hands resting on their belts. Behind them stood Cordelia Blackthorne, HOA president and suburban tyrant in designer sunglasses, leaning smugly against her pearl-white Lexus. Arms crossed, lips curled, she looked like a queen watching her peasants face judgment. What she didn't realize was that for half a year I'd been quietly compiling evidence against her. A web of falsified invoices, double-billed maintenance contracts, and unreported dues. She thought she'd humiliate me by calling the cops. Instead, she just handed me the last piece I needed for my federal case. The irony was almost too perfect. She weaponized authority. I was authority. As the officers approached, I took a slow breath and wiped my forehead with the back of my wrist. The heat shimmered off the blacktop, and every nerve in me was wired but calm. "Sir, we got a call about trespassing," one of them said. I almost smiled. "On whose property?" I asked. He looked at his tablet, read the address, then hesitated. "This one." I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my county-issued badge, and held it up. "Then I'd say we've got a problem, officer." Behind them, Cordelia's smirk faltered for half a second, just enough to show she hadn't seen it coming. I explained, politely, that this was my property, my fence, and my weekend project. The lead officer checked the deed database on his in-car system, came back red-faced, and muttered something about miscommunication. Cordelia tried to spin it, pretending it was a simple misunderstanding. But the damage was done. 3 police cruisers, for witnesses, 1 recorded dispatch log, all proving she'd filed a false report. I didn't need to yell or threaten. I just looked at her and said, "You've made a serious legal error." Her posture stiffened. She didn't know it yet, but her empire was starting to crack that very minute. Let me rewind. My name's Harrison Webb, and I've served as a municipal judge for 2 decades. My life has been defined by order, by rules, by the quiet satisfaction of keeping chaos out of small-town Texas. But after my divorce finalized last spring, I found myself needing more than peace. I needed purpose. The courthouse felt empty, my evenings quieter than they should have been. That's when I started looking for a new place, somewhere to rebuild from the ground up. Maplewood Estates looked like the answer. A neatly trimmed community of 147 homes, tucked just outside Riverside County, where kids still rode bikes and waved to strangers. The lawns were green, the mailboxes matched, and the air carried that mix of jasmine and fresh-cut grass that makes you think life might just turn itself around. My new house sat on a corner lot, shaded by 2 oak trees, with a backyard big enough for the woodworking shed I dreamed about for years. After the paperwork cleared, I thought I'd finally found quiet. The HOA brochure talked about preserving beauty and harmony. I believed them for about 3 weeks. Then I met Cordelia Blackthorne, and harmony became history. Cordelia Blackthorne wasn't the kind of woman you forgot after meeting once. She had presence, the kind that didn't ask for attention, it demanded it. Her hair was cut in a sharp, weaponized bob that could have sliced through glass, and she dressed like she was perpetually heading to a boardroom ambush. Her white Lexus never had a speck of dust on it, even in a Texas summer, and somehow she always appeared when you least wanted company. She was the HOA president, 8 years running unopposed. Neighbors said she kept Maplewood orderly. What they really meant was controlled. She monitored paint colors, lawn heights, mailbox shapes, and once even fined a man for leaving his trash cans out 10 minutes past collection time. She smiled while doing it, too, a brittle, rehearsed expression that didn't reach her eyes. Cordelia thrived on power, and the HOA was her kingdom. I first met her 3 days after moving in. I was sanding an old cedar bench in my driveway when her Lexus rolled up like a ghost ship. Window down, sunglasses on. "Mr. Webb," she'd said, "welcome to Maplewood. We take pride in appearances here." That should have been my first warning. Appearances always came before truth. The HOA handbook was 67 pages long, written like legislation and enforced like gospel. You needed approval to build a shed, paint your shutters, or plant a tree taller than 6 feet. But the deeper I read, the more contradictions I found. Rules that favored certain addresses, exemptions for executive board members. It didn't take long to see that Cordelia and her friends had crafted the bylaws to benefit themselves. They waived fees for their own landscaping, redirected maintenance contracts to companies they quietly owned, and fined residents for imagined violations. The whole thing stank of corruption, and as a judge, I could smell a fraudulent operation a mile away. But I didn't move to Maplewood to start a war. I wanted peace, sawdust, and weekends spent building furniture instead of verdicts. So I played along, paid my dues, kept quiet. For 6 months, I studied their paper trail. I gathered board meeting recordings, falsified invoices, and mismatched signatures. The case was practically building itself. All I needed was one reckless act to tie Cordelia to abuse of authority. She gave me that act when she called the police. She didn't just cross a line. She drew one in front of me and dared me to erase it. When the squad cars finally pulled out of my driveway, a strange silence settled over the street. The kind that hums in your ears after chaos leaves. I stood there, shovel still in the dirt, watching the dust clouds fade behind taillights. Cordelia lingered at the end of the sidewalk, pretending to check her phone while I stared straight through her. She knew she'd lost the moment, but her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. She tossed me one last look, chin high, then marched to her Lexus and slammed the door hard enough to rattle her perfect facade. I could almost hear her mind spinning, crafting the next move in whatever petty chess game she thought she was playing. I went inside, poured a glass of water, and turned on the ceiling fan. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older than it had that morning, tired maybe, but steady. I knew what I had to do. Her little stunt wasn't just harassment. It was criminal misuse of emergency services. The kind of thing that made judges lose patience and prosecutors take notes. I opened my laptop, logged into the county evidence portal, and began uploading everything I had on Maplewood Estates. The war had started quietly. Now it was official. Cordelia's empire wasn't built overnight. It thrived on intimidation and paperwork, small manipulations that piled up until good people stopped fighting back. I found invoices signed by her and paid to shell companies that didn't exist beyond a P.O. box. Landscaping contracts for lawns that never got mowed. Security patrols billed twice in the same month. Residents too scared or exhausted to question the charges. She ruled through fatigue. She wore people down until silence felt easier than confrontation. But I'd seen that kind of rot before. Corruption hides in plain sight, disguised as procedure. I cross-referenced her transactions, traced her so-called vendors, and built a timeline of deceit that stretched back 8 years. Every document was another nail in the coffin she didn't know she was building for herself. I wasn't driven by revenge. This was about justice, about principle. But the more I read, the more personal it became. She'd stolen from retirees, single parents, and veterans, people who trusted the system she manipulated. And now she'd brought that scheme to my backyard. She wanted control, and I wanted truth. Only one of us could keep what we wanted when this ended. Word spreads fast in suburban streets. By Monday morning, everyone knew the cops had been called to my house. Half the neighborhood pretended not to stare as I left for the courthouse, their blinds twitching like nervous eyes. I could feel the quiet divide forming, those who feared Cordelia's wrath and those secretly rooting for me to bring her down. That evening, my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, shuffled over with a casserole and a worried look. She whispered about how Cordelia fined her for planting the wrong color roses last year, then made her replant them at her own expense. Another man down the block told me his fence replacement was rejected 3 times for being an inch too tall, but Cordelia's own fence, 2 inches higher, was grandfathered in. Every story lined up with the same pattern of abuse. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by sawdust and notes, the hum of a small fan keeping rhythm with my thoughts. It wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger, an entire neighborhood held hostage by a woman who mistook power for purpose. I could feel the cage tightening around her like a noose. The question wasn't if she'd fall. It was when. The first real break came during a board meeting 2 weeks later. I attended quietly, blending in with the folding chair crowd of irritated homeowners. Cordelia stood at the podium, rehearsed and radiant, reciting numbers from a clipboard like scripture. But her voice faltered when I raised my hand. "Judge Webb," she said, her smile brittle. "Do you have a question?" I didn't need one. I simply held up a printed invoice, one of her fraudulent ones, and asked, "Could you explain this?" The room went dead silent. The treasurer's pen froze mid-note. She glanced at the paper, then at me, and tried to laugh it off. "A clerical mix-up," she claimed. "Happens all the time. Except this one linked directly to her personal bank account." I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly, letting the tension hang heavy. By the end of the meeting, people weren't whispering, they were staring. Cordelia ended the session early, muttering something about rescheduling. When she stormed past me on her way out, her perfume trailed behind like smoke after a gunshot. She'd been exposed, even if no one said it aloud yet. The predator had finally felt the sting of being watched. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my mailbox. "Unauthorized structure construction," it read in bold print. My fence, the same one I'd been repairing when she called the cops, was suddenly non-compliant. I almost laughed. Petty retaliation was her language. She wanted me rattled, off balance. But all it did was prove motive. I photographed the notice, documented the time, and added it to the evidence file. Over the next week, 5 more infractions appeared: overgrown grass, improper waste storage, excessive noise, each more absurd than the last. It was harassment wrapped in official stationery. I refused to react. Instead, I invited 2 neighbors to witness the conditions and sign affidavits confirming none of the violations were valid. I wanted her paper trail to trap her, not me. Cordelia was clever, but arrogance always blinds the clever. She thought she was playing homeowner chess. She didn't realize she'd stepped into a courtroom she couldn't control, mine. By the time the second month rolled in, Cordelia's composure began to fray. You could see it in the way she drove, faster, jerkier, like her Lexus was fueled by frustration. The neighborhood was shifting against her. People who once avoided eye contact now waved when I passed, some even stopping to share their own horror stories. The illusion of her control was cracking. I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox one evening, no return address, just photocopies of internal HOA emails. They revealed inflated maintenance bids and payments routed through her husband's construction company. That was the proof I'd been waiting for. Every line of text was another layer of rot peeled back. I forwarded it to the county investigator I'd been quietly working with, then poured myself a whiskey and watched the sun drop behind the oaks. The air felt electric, heavy with the sense that things were moving faster than either of us could stop. Cordelia had spent years weaponizing fear. Now that weapon had turned on her. She'd awakened a fight she didn't understand, a legal one, not ruled by intimidation, but by evidence, law, and consequence. The storm she'd built was finally coming home. The next board meeting was chaos. Half the residents showed up early, murmuring in tight clusters, their patience long gone. I sat near the back, hands folded, watching Cordelia try to hold her fake smile as the crowd demanded answers. The treasurer resigned on the spot, slamming a folder on the table and walking out without a word. A secretary tried to calm everyone, but her voice trembled too much to command the room. When I stood to speak, the crowd went silent again. I didn't raise my voice. I just read from the bylaws. Section 8.3 Embezzlement of association funds constitutes immediate removal from office. Then I read the evidence, line by line, payment by payment, until the whispers grew into a low roar of outrage. Cordelia's face flushed red, then pale. She tried to cut me off, claiming defamation, but no one believed her anymore. The meeting adjourned in disarray, and as she left, she refused to look at anyone. Her heels clicked like hammers on tile, sharp and fast. I'd seen that walk before, from people who knew they were caught but hadn't yet accepted defeat. Her power was slipping through her manicured fingers, and everyone knew it. Days after that meeting, Cordelia doubled down. She filed a restraining order against me, claiming I was harassing her and interfering with HOA business. The irony was suffocating. My attorney laughed when he read it. "She's panicking," he said. "This isn't about law, it's about ego." We filed a counterclaim for defamation and abuse of process, attaching every false violation she'd ever mailed me. The case began to gain quiet attention around the courthouse. Judges whispered in corridors. Clerks shared knowing looks. They all knew how this story ended. It was just a matter of paperwork catching up to justice. Meanwhile, neighbors began replacing their "no trespassing" signs with something new. "We support accountability." The sight of those words in neat rows across front yards was almost poetic. Cordelia's little kingdom had revolted, and she was alone at the top, surrounded by walls she built herself. She wanted control, but control is fragile. Once people stop believing in it, it turns to dust. Each night, my office turned into a war room. Laptops glowing, folders stacked in color-coded order, every file a weapon of truth. I replayed HOA recordings, Cordelia's voice commanding silence, shutting down dissent. I compared her meeting minutes to actual bank transactions and found discrepancies that screamed fraud. There were ghost employees, duplicate checks, even consulting fees issued to her own personal account. I worked long into the night, coffee turning cold beside my keyboard. The more I uncovered, the clearer her pattern became. She used charm to manipulate, fear to enforce, and paperwork to hide behind. But numbers don't lie. Every transaction left a trail, and that trail pointed straight to her. I wasn't just a judge anymore. I'd become the prosecutor, the investigator, the witness to her undoing. By dawn, I sent the final packet to the district attorney's office. When I finally leaned back, exhaustion settled deep in my bones. I didn't smile. There's no joy in tearing down corruption, just relief in knowing it can't keep standing. It happened faster than anyone expected. The county sheriff's office executed a search warrant at HOA headquarters, a converted model home at the end of Maplewood Drive. Squad cars lined the street, while residents filmed from their porches. Cordelia tried to act composed, walking out in her designer blazer like she was attending a luncheon, but the sight of her Lexus being towed hit her harder than the flashing lights ever could. Word spread across the neighborhood within an hour. Phones buzzed, texts flew, and for the first time in years, people gathered outside, not to gossip, but to celebrate. I stayed home, watching from my porch with a quiet sense of closure. I didn't gloat, didn't speak. I just listened to the sound of normal life returning. Kids laughed. Dogs barked. The air felt lighter. The woman who ruled with fines and fear had finally been stripped of her authority. Justice didn't need to announce itself. It arrived, steady and silent, like the end of a long drought. When Cordelia finally stood before the bench, she looked smaller, like someone who'd lived her whole life on a pedestal and suddenly realized the ground was cold. The courtroom was packed. I wasn't presiding, of course, but I attended quietly in the back row. The prosecution outlined everything: fraudulent billing, embezzlement, misuse of HOA funds, false reporting. Her attorney tried to paint her as misguided, claiming she only sought to maintain order. But order built on theft isn't order, it's tyranny. When the judge read her sentence, 3 years, suspended with restitution and a lifetime ban from HOA leadership, she didn't cry. She just stared at the floor, lips trembling, as if the sound of her own downfall was too loud to bear. Outside, reporters swarmed. Neighbors walked past her without a glance. I stepped into the sunlight, breathing deep. It wasn't victory I felt. It was peace, the kind that comes only when justice finally catches up to arrogance. Months passed, and Maplewood began to feel like the place I'd hoped it would be. Lawns grew wild again before being trimmed, laughter replaced tension, and the board rebuilt itself with honest volunteers. Meetings became discussions instead of interrogations. People helped each other repaint fences and fix roofs without worrying about fines. The air of fear that once hung over every streetlight was gone. Sometimes I'd see kids ride past my house, their bikes wobbling along the pavement, and realize this was what community was supposed to look like. Not paperwork and penalties, but people. My workshop finally came to life too. I spent weekends shaping oak and cedar, building tables and chairs for neighbors who'd once been strangers. Cordelia's name faded from conversation, like a bad dream that slowly loses shape after you wake. The neighborhood had endured her reign, but now it was stronger for surviving it. I often found myself thinking about how easily power corrupts. Cordelia didn't start out evil, just ambitious, convinced she knew what was best for everyone else. But unchecked authority is a dangerous drug. Give someone a rule book and no accountability, and you'll watch them turn it into a weapon. I'd seen it in courtrooms, and now I'd seen it on my own street. Some nights, I sat in my workshop, sanding a tabletop smooth, the scent of cedar thick in the air, and wondered how many other neighborhoods were living under the same quiet tyranny. The tools I held felt grounding, real honest. Wood doesn't lie. You shape it, it holds your intent. Maybe that's why I'd always loved it. After years of words and laws, creating something tangible felt like redemption. In the end, I hadn't just built a case. I'd rebuilt myself. One evening, long after everything settled, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, Cordelia stood there, not dressed to impress this time, just jeans and a worn sweater. She looked older, humbled. She didn't ask to come in, just said, "I wanted to say, I went too far." Her voice cracked. I studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "You did." She waited, maybe for anger or forgiveness, but I gave her neither. Only truth. "The rules exist to protect people, not to control them," I said quietly. She nodded, eyes glistening, then turned and walked away into the dim streetlight. I closed the door, not out of bitterness, but finality. Some endings don't need more words. The past had knocked, confessed, and left. These days, mornings start the same way they used to. Sunlight over the oaks, coffee steaming on the porch rail, and the sound of birds instead of sirens. The fence I built that morning still stands, strong and straight. It's a reminder that sometimes boundaries are worth defending. Maplewood is calm now, the HOA reborn under leadership that remembers what community means. I still get letters from other judges, asking about the case, about the precedent it set. I always tell them the same thing: justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. My story isn't one of revenge. It's proof that truth, when patient enough, outlasts lies. And every time I step into my backyard, where the whole mess began, I smile a little. Not because I won, but because peace, hard-earned and honest, finally found its way home.